I'm with Paul Adams, and in 1952, Paul was this young man in this poster. So Paul, can you tell us about your experience with that?
Yes, we lived on a farm out near Center, Cambridge, New York, and my mother and grandmother knew Grandma Moses. They were friends with Grandma Moses. Of course, Norman Rockwell was friends with Grandma Moses, and Norman Rockwell asked Grandma Moses if she knew of any, back then they called them colored families, that were interested in modeling. Well, Grandma Moses said, well, I know Martha Adams has 4 kids, they might be interested. So Norman Rockwell got a hold of my mother and talked it over with her, but we didn't have any way to come over here. My mother didn't drive, so Norman Rockwell paid for a taxi to bring us over to West Arlington for modeling. And I was, it was in the winter time, I think, and I was 7 years old, and in this picture, and Pauline was 5. And
Pauline's your sister?
Yes, Pauline's my sister, and Pauline Adams Grimes, and we each got $5 for modeling. We thought that was a lot of money, and but he did do a charcoal sketch of my older brother Carl and my younger sister Mary Beth. But they weren't in the picture. And this lady was from Cambridge, friends of ours, Mrs. Olaf and her grandson. So we knew this lady here, but we didn't know anybody else in the picture. Did
he actually have all these people there in one sitting?
No, it was just our family. It was the only one in the studio, and it was like the afternoon. And actually, I was holding a clay planter. And he wanted us to, we had white shirts on like we were dressed for church, my brother and I, but he had us take our shirts off, and he added on the earrings. I didn't have the earrings or the necklace. He added that on. But I had to stand for about 20 minutes or half an hour, but he kind of bribed my sister and I, Pauline. He said, if you could stand for about 20 minutes or more, he says, when you leave, he says, I'll give you a great big bottle of Coca-Cola, like a 16-ounce bottle of Coca-Cola. He had them out in the snowbank. So we said, you know, we're gonna do the best we can. So when we got ready to leave, Pauline and I went over to get the soda, and my mother says, come on, you don't touch that. Says, the taxi's waiting for us, we have to go. She didn't know that, so we didn't get our Coca-Cola.
I'm with Ruth Skelly, and she also was a model for Norman Rockwell. Ruth, what year did you model?
April 1939.
And what was your age?
I think I was probably 11 or 12 years old.
So you were old enough to remember?
Oh, yes. Remember it very well.
Can you tell us about that experience?
Well, he came to Cambridge, New York, looking for a red-haired, pigtailed, freckle-faced, brown-eyed girl. And someone told him that Franklin McLenithan had a daughter that fitted that description. So he came to the farm to look for me, and they told him that I was over to my grandmother's in Shushan. So he came over there and asked if he could paint me. And Graham said, well, yes. And he asked, do you want to do it? And I said, sure, be glad to. So he came back and picked us up and told me that he wanted me to have a green and white dress, leave my hair in pigtails, which I hated, and green knee socks. And that would it be all right if I had the dress I had a new dress that was just made for me. Then he wanted to know if he was going to pose another girl also. We were going to take turns. And would it be all right for her to wear the dress? And I said, sure. I said, no problem. So all afternoon we posed, and he very meticulous on every way we sat or every way that we kneeled. It was a very memorable afternoon. He had the patience I couldn't believe that he would. All afternoon, you know, the girl and I would change clothes, and the boys would laugh and smile. We had a great time. It was really great. And then shortly after that, the studio burned. And I'm sure that some of the original copies that were also burned.
Yeah.
So when the post came out in September of '39, Dad went down to the drugstore, and he bought all the magazines with my picture on it down there, the Marble Shooter. And he passed them all out to everyone, but he never saved one for the family. So, but my aunt, thank goodness, she had a copy, and she gave it to me years later. So I have an original copy of the Saturday Evening Post.
I was 6 years old, and so I was obviously a little kid, didn't really know what was going on at the moment, but my dad drove us down to Norman's studio. I had a bag of my pajamas and slippers and things like that, so I wasn't sure really what to expect. But we got down there, and the events unfolded. Evidently, I was a little bit obstreperous at the time, so the modeling didn't really work out exactly the way Norman wanted it. And at the last minute, he turned the two kids around in our image, so my back is now to the camera. This cover of Child Life magazine in 1953 at Christmas, and you can see the two little kids, and I'm on the left, and this is Melinda Pelham on the right, and she's another neighbor of ours. Her dad was a photographer for Norman Rockwell, and so she was also modeled in several of the covers or many illustrations for Rockwell as well.
From an early age, I was blessed, there's no other word for it, to know a generation of New England men and women who would now, if they lived, be somewhere between 100 and 140 years old. Men and women in a little town where we have, to this day, have a camp in Washington County, Maine. And these were men and women who had lived there well before the advent of power tools for the men. They worked with hand tools in the woods. Many of them drove logs down the Machias River to the ocean, where they were picked up by schooners and taken to busier ports to the south. To call the women housewives would be absurd. They dressed game, raised gardens, split kindling, gathered firewood, cooked in wood-fired ovens, and kept the home fires literally burning, which was a great challenge, needless to say. And because they had no other form of entertainment to repair to, there was obviously no television, there was not even any radio. The nearest movie theater was probably in Bangor, in those days 4 hours away. They had to make their own entertainment, and as a result, they were, to a man and woman, some better than others, but all anything but slouches, as narrators, as storytellers. And I just recently read a very interesting book called On an Irish Island, which is about Great Blasket off the coast of Kerry. And I was quite taken with the similarities between that old culture and the one that I'm referring to, where language and stories became a kind of community property. And I heard those voices in my head and hear them today, every day, all day long. So when I got to Upper New England to live in 1968, I sought out their equivalents amongst New Hampshire and Vermont people, and cultivated many a very, very valuable friendship in that way. Now, I wanted to get those voices onto the page as a writer, but I didn't want to write dialect because I didn't think I had the genius of Mark Twain or Willa Cather or such a writer, so that I could write dialect without sounding either artificial or condescending, which was the last way I felt about these people. And so I began to write poetry, and my rationale was that though I wouldn't write dialect, I might be able to capture the rhythms and the cadences of that old speech without having to imitate it. So my early poems were quite specifically narrative poems. They were short stories, such as I had written in college, but they were written in verse. Okay, back to Dartmouth College and my dilemma with this PhD dissertation. I ultimately did finish it, and heaved a huge sigh of relief and went about my business. And I taught all kinds of courses, but I continued to teach this one writing course. For whatever reason, the students seemed to think I did better than I thought I did. And so I kept getting it. Nobody else wanted to do it anyway. They had no interest in living writers. They were more interested in dead ones. And I was interested in both. So they gave me that course. And yet the same chairman of the department, who was and remained until his fairly recent death, a great friend of mine, a man to whom I feel great gratitude, came to me again as an act of kindness and said, you know, people are beginning to like you around here, but we have this saying, I'm glad it didn't apply to me when I was your age, but it's publish or perish. Well, I pointed out that since I had started writing poetry, I had gotten pretty lucky pretty quickly. I had poems in the New Yorker and the Atlantic and in the New Republic and the Nation and all the high-end literary magazines, but publishing poetry was not real publication in those days. That wouldn't count. I even had a book under contract, but publishing a book of poems did not cut it by the standards of the time. It's utterly different now. So he said, but in those days, you didn't have to write a book of scholarship. We didn't have to publish a book of scholarship that no one would read, but just a few articles of scholarship that no one would read. So I said to myself, says I, well, there must be a few chapters in that dissertation that I can dust off and polish and see if I can get them published in studies in Romanticism or English literary history or whatever. And so I took this thing over to the library, and I used to like, for whatever reason, there was a desk in the reference room at the Baker Library at Dartmouth that I liked to use, despite the fact that that room was presided over, and I'm not making this up, by a very bitter older woman whose name was Miss Wormwood. Miss Wormwood, my first confrontation with Miss Wormwood was when I went to her and said, I want to put the following books on the reserve shelf for my students. And she said, whose students? I said, my students. She said, you're a student yourself. I mean, I was only 27, so, and sort of youthful looking. So she finally, I had to show her my faculty ID card before she would believe me. So she was a real tartar. But she would glare at me whenever I came in. For some reason, I don't know what I'd done to offend her. But so I opened up the dissertation, trying to imagine which chapters I would take to polish and publish. And I had the sort of feeling that one gets on looking down from a great height over a precipice, a kind of vertigo, and my stomach began to knot. And I said, in spite of myself, to Miss Wormwood's considerable consternation, "This is not what I want to do when I grow up." Well, by then I was 33 or such a matter, so many people would have been grown up by then, but I felt I hadn't found a vehicle for my own maturation. So I closed it, and I said to myself, I'm just going to keep on writing poetry and let the chips fall where they may. And the chips fell as I knew they would, and as he had told me they would. When they fell, I was not given tenure. I was lucky enough, however, to be hired almost immediately at Middlebury College, where the tradition of writer-professors had some history. It had been going on for quite a while. And I was treated, if anything, like a first-class citizen there. Not that I was shabbily treated at Dartmouth, but my interest in poetry, oddly enough, in a literature department, seemed a kind of an aberration, that they didn't want to deal with. And I taught there quite a long time. And then in the last 10 years of my 43 years of teaching at the college university level, I came back to Dartmouth and taught there. It took me that long to get good enough to come back, I guess. Anyway, and then I retired a little over a year ago. And shortly, I was a little worried about retiring because I loved teaching, and I got kind of charged up by my students, a lot more than by my colleagues, I might say. It's no fault of the colleagues, but there was just something about that interaction with the younger people that I liked. And I was kind of nervous about the retirement, and then I was installed as poet laureate. I wish that word installed, there was something else than it makes me think of some great mountain goat or something put into a glass case, and stuffed or whatever. But and that has kept me on the road, going from library to library. So I'll read a few of my own poems, and then if you have some questions to ask, I'm happy to answer them as best I can. I won't read many because I've gone on a bit too long, perhaps. All right, I'll read this one. This is called Fathomless. I remember that store and the nasty redneck whose stink seemed a challenge to everyone in it. The scene is decades old, but I'm still confused that no one took up the challenge, including me, though I liked an occasional fight back then. The prospect of pain meant less to me once, I guess. An aneurysm had just killed my brother, so the pain I'm talking about was my body's. I breathed up another pain that day. I checked the man's beat pickup. Why would he want them, those skunks, knee-deep in its bed? I left the lot still more confused, my sweet retriever shivering on the seat beside me. The god-awful smell still clung to the dog's wet coat and my own. There'd be no more hikes for us that morning. Rain had arrived, bone-chilling. If you killed the skunk, why would you keep the thing? To kill some time, I stopped at the Jackpot View. We've always called it that. 5 mountaintops bled into mist to my east in New Hampshire. The sudden squalls spilled leaves on the woods floor's pall of nondescript hue. Now he was dead. Now my brother was dead. I can't define any God, but only this morning I caught a whiff of road-killed skunk and thought I could speak of him or her or it as surely as I could tell you the slightest thing concerning the man I'm remembering now. The one who shot or trapped or clubbed those miserable, reeking creatures. The smallest enigmas we ever encountered remain as hard to explain as all the epical ones. I've failed for years to fathom the death of my brother. But it's just as hard to understand why a scene in an old Vermont store should linger like dead skunk odor, which, if you've lately been tainted, comes back to scent you whenever a rain blows in. Or like some pains, you may have thought you'd forever gotten over, but which, at some odd prompting, come back to haunt you. I'll read this one called Victory Garden. I have a wonderful neighbor. He'll turn 90 at the end of next week. Well, much could be said about Tink. He's gotten very arthritic suddenly. I mean, when he was 80, it took a young, fit 60-year-old to keep up with his pace. And now he's pretty crippled, and it's sad to watch him struggle and to do all the things he's always done. I was moved to see him sitting in the shade while his wife, almost of equal age, but a bit less pained in her body, did their huge garden that they do every year. He still refinishes furniture that he buys at flea markets and resells it, but it's more of a struggle than it used to be. This poem was called originally Self-Pity because it's laden with self-pity, which I hope is purged by the end of it. But self-pity seemed a little bit over-determined, so I call it Victory Garden. So here I am again, as ever, moping on things that vanish, boo-hoo. This time, for no reason whatever, those wheels of cheese under clear glass domes displayed on the counters at general stores, all vanishing too. It doesn't take much to start me. I'm driving back from our own town's uncheesed store with a paper and it's freight of awful news from everywhere on Earth. And I wonder just how long that Earth can survive. But I'm moping too that my wife came home today with a desk that once belonged to her vanished grandma and looks to be as heavy as 15 anvils. And it's 90 sopping degrees outside, the globe burning up, and I'll be sweating lugging that awful load, my hands both useless against the deer fly's blitz, which will get me down too. And we don't have room anyhow for this monster. I'm 70. I need to be getting rid of things, not taking them on. And this morning, I picked what seemed like 100 ticks from our dogs. We never had ticks here, not until lately. But now, I pass Polly, our ancient neighbor, a bonnet, her shield against those ticks and flies, unmindful of any such nuisance as she weeds her garden. And she looks up, all proud of her work, you can tell, and kneeling, waves and offers me a friendly smile, as if someone had told her, say cheese. And as if, in spite of headlines like the one I saw at the store when I glanced at the paper, husband blinds his wife with acid. While her funny and ornery husband Tink, in spite of lumbago, stands some yards behind her in their shed to sand a mammoth sideboard, so lost in his labor, he doesn't even see me. Not that he needs to. Thank you.